The eviction notice was taped to the door of my Park Avenue penthouse, and for a moment, I couldn't process the absurdity of it. I'm Gary Whitman III, heir to a textile fortune, owner of 4 luxury cars, and apparently someone who'd forgotten to pay rent for 3 months because I'd been too disorganized to open my mail. Standing there in my $3,000 suit, holding a piece of paper that threatened to make me homeless, I faced a paradox that had been haunting me for years. How can someone with every advantage in life be so spectacularly bad at the basic tasks of living? The irony wasn't lost on me. My trust fund generated more money in a month than most people made in a year, yet I was being evicted because I couldn't manage the simple act of writing a check. My father, who'd built an empire through meticulous attention to detail, would have been mortified to see his son's life unraveling through sheer negligence. Mr. Whitman? The building manager's voice cut through my spiraling thoughts. We need to discuss this situation. Inside my apartment, if I could still call it that, the evidence of my dysfunction was everywhere. Unopened bills scattered across marble countertops like confetti from a very expensive party. Designer clothes draped over furniture because I'd never learned to use a closet properly. 3 different housekeepers had quit in the past year, unable to cope with my chaos despite the generous wages I offered. But the eviction notice was just the latest in a string of consequences that had been building for months. My Porsche had been repossessed because I'd missed car payments I could easily afford. My credit score had plummeted despite having liquid assets that most people could only dream of. My relationships had withered because friends got tired of my constant lateness, my broken promises, and my inability to follow through on the simplest commitments. The thing is, I told my friend Marcus just last week, I know what I need to do. I just can't seem to make myself do it. Have you tried setting alarms? Making lists? Getting organized? He'd suggested, with the patient tone of someone who'd had this conversation with me dozens of times. I've tried everything, I'd replied, which was true. My apartment was littered with productivity apps, self-help books, and organizational systems that I'd enthusiastically adopted and quickly abandoned. Day planners sat and used after the second week. Meditation apps remained downloaded but unopened. Personal assistants were hired and fired when they tried to impose structure on my beautifully chaotic lifestyle. The worst part wasn't the practical consequences. Those could be fixed with money. The worst part was the crushing shame that came with knowing I was wasting a life that others would kill for. My parents had given me every advantage. The best schools, unlimited resources, connections that could open any door. And I was squandering it all because I couldn't master the basic skills that most adults learned in their 20s. You're self-sabotaging, my therapist Dr. Richardson had diagnosed after 6 months of sessions. You have a fear of success that manifests as learned helplessness. But that explanation felt incomplete. I didn't fear success, I craved it. I wanted to build something meaningful, to honor my family's legacy, to prove that privilege hadn't made me weak. The problem was that every attempt to change my behavior seemed to make things worse. I tried the tough love approach, setting strict rules and harsh consequences for myself. When that failed, I tried the gentle approach, being compassionate and forgiving when I inevitably fell short. I'd attempted complete lifestyle overhauls and tiny habit changes. I'd read every productivity guru, attended seminars, even hired a life coach who charged $500 an hour to tell me things I already knew. Nothing worked. Or rather, nothing worked for more than a few weeks before the old patterns reasserted themselves like gravity, pulling me back to my natural state of expensive chaos. Standing in my soon-to-be former home, surrounded by the detritus of a life lived without intention, I finally asked myself the question that terrified me most. What if I was simply incapable of change? What if 32 years of having everything handed to me had permanently broken whatever part of the brain was responsible for self-discipline and follow-through? The question that would consume me for the next year was this: how do you motivate someone who has no real consequences for failure and no experience with the struggle that builds character? I had no idea that the answer would come from a behavioral scientist in Connecticut who would teach me that everything I'd been told about motivation and willpower was not just wrong, it was backward. But first, I had to discover just how deep my dysfunction ran and how much damage I was willing to inflict on my life before I found the courage to try a completely different approach. The eviction notice was just the beginning. The weeks following my eviction became a masterclass in how good intentions and unlimited resources can create an even bigger mess when combined with a fundamental misunderstanding of human motivation. I threw myself into what I called Operation Get Your Act Together, a comprehensive plan to finally become the disciplined, organized person I'd always meant to be. First came the fear-based motivation phase. I hired a financial advisor to show me charts and graphs detailing exactly how my careless spending and missed opportunities were costing me. He calculated that my disorganization had already cost me approximately $180,000 in late fees, missed investment opportunities, and repossessed assets. At this rate, he warned, pointing to a particularly alarming projection, you'll burn through your trust fund in 15 years. You'll be broke by 50. I left his office genuinely terrified, convinced that fear of financial ruin would finally shock me into responsible behavior. For exactly 9 days, I was a model of fiscal responsibility. I opened every piece of mail, paid bills immediately, and tracked every expense in a detailed spreadsheet. Then my friend David invited me to join him for a spontaneous weekend in the Hamptons, and my carefully constructed system collapsed like a house of cards. I forgot to pay my electricity bill, missed a crucial meeting with my accountant, and somehow lost my debit card at a party, necessitating an expensive emergency replacement. Maybe you need stronger consequences, suggested my new life coach, Dr. Patricia Wells, whom I'd hired after finding the first one too accommodating. What if you donate $1,000 to a charity you hate every time you miss a deadline? The punishment strategy lasted slightly longer, 2 weeks. But I quickly discovered that someone with my resources could absorb financial penalties without real discomfort. Losing $1,000 felt like an inconvenience, not a catastrophe. And paradoxically, the punishment system seemed to give me permission to fail, as if paying the penalty somehow absolved me of the need to actually change. Next came the complete lifestyle overhaul phase. I hired a professional organizer, a personal assistant, a meal prep service, and a driver to eliminate every possible obstacle to perfect behavior. My apartment was transformed into a minimalist paradise with designated places for everything and systems that supposedly made organization effortless. The environment shapes behavior, the organizer explained as she installed color-coded filing systems and digital calendars that synced across all my devices. Remove the friction, and the change becomes automatic. For a month, the system worked beautifully. Bills were paid, appointments were kept, and my life ran with Swiss precision. I felt like I'd finally cracked the code of adult responsibility. Then the personal assistant quit for a better opportunity. The meal service made a delivery error that disrupted my eating schedule, and the perfectly organized systems began to degrade without constant maintenance. Within 6 weeks, my minimalist paradise had returned to its natural state of expensive chaos, but now with the added sting of knowing exactly how much I'd spent trying to fix myself. The breaking point came during what should have been a triumph. My father's 65th birthday party at the family estate in Connecticut. I'd promised to give a speech honoring his achievements and our family's legacy. I'd even written it weeks in advance, a thoughtful, heartfelt tribute that captured everything I wanted to say about the man who'd built our fortune from nothing. But on the day of the party, I couldn't find the speech. I'd written it, printed it, and then somehow misplaced it in the organizational system that was supposed to make such losses impossible. As 200 guests waited, I stood at the podium improvising a rambling, inadequate tribute that failed to capture even a fraction of what my father meant to me. Afterward, my father pulled me aside with the gentle disappointment that hurt more than any anger could have. "Gary," he said, "I'm not upset about the speech. I'm worried about you. You have so much potential, but you seem to be fighting against yourself at every turn. I don't know what's wrong with me, Dad. I try to change, but nothing sticks. Maybe you're trying too hard in the wrong direction," he said. "Have you considered that the problem might not be your willpower, but your approach to building it?" That night, I did something I'd never done before. I Googled, "Why do smart people fail at behavior change?" with genuine desperation rather than casual interest. What I found was a rabbit hole of research suggesting that everything I'd been told about motivation, fear-based consequences, willpower training, massive lifestyle changes, was not only ineffective but often counterproductive. One study in particular caught my attention. Research from Yale showing that people who tried to scare themselves into behavior change often experienced what psychologists called psychological reactance, a subconscious rebellion against being controlled, even by themselves. Maybe I've been trying to threaten myself into compliance, I muttered to my empty apartment. And maybe that's exactly why it's not working. But the question remained. If fear and willpower and complete system overhauls didn't work, what did? And more importantly, was it possible that someone like me, someone who'd never had to develop real self-discipline, could learn to change behavior without the external pressures that most people use to motivate themselves? I had no idea that the answer would come from a professor in my own backyard who specialized in exactly what I'd been struggling with, and who would introduce me to research so compelling that it would completely invert my understanding of how motivation actually works. But first, I had to accept that my privileged background wasn't just irrelevant to my struggles. It might actually be the source of them. The lecture was called The Science of Motivation: Why Warnings Don't Work, and I'd only stumbled across it because I was wandering around Yale's campus trying to kill time before meeting a friend for dinner. The speaker was Dr. Watson Hayes, a professor of behavioral sciences who I'd never heard of, but who had the kind of presence that filled a room even before he started talking. I slipped into the back row of the packed auditorium, expecting another dry academic presentation. Instead, I found myself listening to someone describe my life with uncomfortable precision. How many of you, Dr. Hayes began, have ever tried to scare yourself into changing your behavior? Maybe you've told yourself you'll get fat if you don't exercise, or you'll fail if you don't get organized. My hand stayed firmly in my lap, but internally I was raising it with both arms. And how many of you found that those threats actually worked long-term? This time, almost no hands went up. That's because, Dr. Hayes continued, the human brain is fundamentally wired to resist threats, even threats we make to ourselves. When you try to scare yourself into compliance, you're essentially putting your own psyche into fight or flight mode. And what do animals do when they're scared? They freeze, flee, or fight back. He clicked to a slide showing brain scans. Dr. Tali Sharrett's research at University College London demonstrates that when people are presented with negative information about their future, the brain literally stops processing it accurately. We have what she calls an optimism bias. We're neurologically designed to focus on positive possibilities and avoid dwelling on negative ones. I thought about all the financial projections and dire warnings I'd been subjecting myself to, wondering why they'd felt so easy to dismiss. But here's what's fascinating, Dr. Hayes continued. The same research shows that people are remarkably responsive to positive motivation. Information about progress, improvement, and potential gains gets processed much more effectively than warnings about losses. After the lecture, I approached Dr. Hayes with the kind of desperation usually reserved for emergency rooms. Dr. Hayes, I think I've been doing everything wrong. I've been trying to threaten myself into better behavior for years, and it's only made things worse. He studied me with the clinical curiosity of someone who'd heard this confession many times before. Tell me about your situation. For the next 20 minutes, standing in that emptying auditorium, I told a complete stranger about my privileged dysfunction, my failed attempts at self-discipline, and my growing conviction that I was fundamentally broken. Gary, Dr. Hayes said when I finished, what you're describing isn't personal failure. It's predictable psychology. Everything you've tried goes against how the human brain actually responds to behavior change attempts. What do you mean? He pulled out his phone and showed me data from a study he'd recently published. We tracked 200 people attempting various behavior changes over 6 months. Those who used fear-based motivation had a 23% success rate. Those who used what we call positive motivation principles had a 78% success rate. Positive motivation principles. 3 things that actually work with human psychology instead of against it, Dr. Hayes explained. Social incentives, showing people what others are doing successfully. Immediate rewards, providing instant gratification for good choices. And progress monitoring, highlighting improvement rather than focusing on failures. He mentioned a study from a hospital where hand-washing compliance went from 10% to 90% simply by installing electronic boards that showed staff how well they were doing in real time compared to other shifts. But I've tried reward systems, I protested. They don't work for me long-term. Because you were probably using delayed rewards or punishment-based systems, Dr. Hayes replied. Let me ask you something. When you were a kid, what made you excited to do things you didn't really want to do? I thought about it. Competition with my friends, I guess. And seeing progress on things I cared about. And getting recognition for doing well. Exactly. Social comparison, immediate feedback, and progress visualization. Those are the three principles that actually motivate human behavior change, regardless of age or background. Dr. Hayes referenced research from Dr. Robert Cialdini at Stanford showing that people are far more likely to change behavior when they see that others like them are already doing it successfully, rather than when they're warned about consequences of not changing. The British government, he explained, increased tax compliance by 15% simply by adding one sentence to their reminder letters. 9 out of 10 people in Britain pay their taxes on time. That one sentence generated an estimated £5.6 billion in additional revenue. But how does this apply to someone like me? I don't have normal consequences or social pressures. That's exactly why you're a perfect candidate for positive motivation, Dr. Hayes smiled. Your privilege has insulated you from fear-based motivation, but it hasn't made you immune to the social and psychological drivers that actually work. He handed me his card. Gary, would you be interested in participating in a study I'm conducting on behavior change in high-resource individuals? I think you might be surprised by what becomes possible when you stop fighting against your own psychology and start working with it. Looking at his card, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years of failed self-improvement attempts. Genuine curiosity about what I might discover about myself if I stopped trying to punish myself into compliance and started exploring what actually motivated me. What would that look like? It would look like designing a behavior change system around who you actually are, not who you think you should be, Dr. Hayes said. And it would mean accepting that your brain is designed to seek progress, recognition, and social connection, not to respond to threats and punishment. As I walked back to my car, I realized that Dr. Hayes had just offered me something no life coach or therapist had ever suggested. The possibility that I wasn't broken, but that I'd been using the wrong tools to try to fix myself. The question was no longer how to force myself to change through fear and willpower. It was how to discover what kinds of positive motivation actually worked for someone like me, and whether 32 years of learned helplessness could be overcome by finally understanding how human motivation actually functions. Dr. Hayes' approach to behavior change was unlike anything I'd encountered in years of self-help attempts. Instead of starting with what I wanted to change, he began with what he called a motivation audit, understanding exactly what already drove me to take action, even in my disorganized life. Tell me about something you actually follow through on consistently, he said during our first official session in his office overlooking the Yale campus. I thought about it. I never miss social events with my friends. I always show up for my tennis games at the club, and I'm obsessively punctual for anything involving my family. Interesting. What do those activities have in common? They involve other people expecting me to be there. Exactly. You respond powerfully to social accountability, but you've been trying to change behavior in isolation. Dr. Hayes pulled out a notebook filled with research citations and handwritten observations. Dr. Micah Edelson's work at Princeton shows that social signals activate the emotional center of the brain in ways that predict behavior change success. You're already wired for social motivation, you just haven't been using it intentionally. Instead of creating another private system doomed to failure, Dr. Hayes had me design what he called a social behavior change network. I identified 5 friends who were also working on personal development goals and proposed a weekly check-in system where we'd share progress and challenges. But won't that be embarrassing when I inevitably fail? I asked. That's exactly the fear-based thinking that's been sabotaging you, Dr. Hayes replied. Instead of focusing on avoiding embarrassment, focus on earning recognition for small improvements. The first week was revelatory. Instead of trying to overhaul my entire life, I committed to 3 tiny behaviors. Opening all mail within 24 hours, putting clothes in the hamper instead of on furniture, and responding to texts within 4 hours. Pathetically small goals by most standards, but for me, they felt achievable. More importantly, I had to report my success rate to the group each week. Knowing that my friends would see my progress created a completely different psychological dynamic than my previous attempts at private self-discipline. I opened 85% of my mail on time this week. I reported during our first check-in, surprised by how good it felt to share a win, however small. "That's amazing progress," my friend Sarah responded. "I'm still at about 60% for my exercise goal." Dr. Hayes had predicted this exact response. Social recognition for progress is neurologically rewarding in ways that delayed consequences never can be, he'd explained. When your friends celebrate your improvement, your brain releases dopamine that makes you want to repeat the behavior. The second principle, immediate rewards, required more creativity. Instead of punishing myself for failures, Dr. Hayes had me design instant gratification for successful behaviors. Every time I completed one of my target behaviors, I allowed myself a small pleasure, a favorite coffee, 10 minutes of a TV show I enjoyed, or a quick call to a friend. "This feels like I'm bribing myself," I told Dr. Hayes after 2 weeks of the system. "You are," he said cheerfully. And research from Harvard's Behavioral Economics Lab shows that immediate rewards are far more effective than delayed consequences for building new habits. Dr. Catherine Milkman's studies prove that people who receive instant gratification for good choices maintain those choices significantly longer than those who rely on willpower alone. The transformation wasn't dramatic. It was gradual and almost imperceptible. But after a month, I realized something remarkable. I was actually looking forward to organizing my mail, responding to messages, and maintaining my living space. Not because I developed superhuman discipline, but because these behaviors had become associated with social recognition and immediate pleasure. The third principle, progress monitoring, became the most powerful element of the system. Dr. Hayes had me track my behavior changes visually, creating charts that showed improvement over time rather than focusing on perfect compliance. Traditional goal-setting focuses on the gap between where you are and where you want to be, he explained, showing me research from Dr. Teresa Amabile at Harvard Business School. But her work on motivation shows that people are most energized by visible progress, not by the distance remaining to their goal. My weekly charts showed steady improvement. Mail opening went from 85% to 92% to 95%. Text response times improved from 4 hours to 2 hours to usually within 30 minutes. My apartment transformed from chaotic to merely untidy to genuinely organized. But the real breakthrough came when Dr. Hayes introduced me to research that completely reframed my relationship with setbacks. Dr. Sherratt's studies show that resilient people don't avoid failure. They interpret failure differently, he explained. Instead of seeing a missed day as evidence that you're fundamentally flawed, they see it as information about what conditions support their success. When I inevitably had bad weeks, travel disrupted my routines, social events threw off my schedules. Instead of catastrophizing and abandoning the system, I analyzed what had happened and adjusted accordingly. Missed 2 days of mail opening during a work trip? Planned better systems for travel weeks. Fell behind on text responses during a family crisis? Build in flexibility for high-stress periods. You're learning to work with your actual life instead of trying to force your life to accommodate perfect systems, Dr. Hayes observed after 3 months of steady improvement. The most surprising aspect of the transformation was how it affected other areas of my life. As my organizational systems became more reliable, I found myself taking on challenges I'd previously avoided. I started a small investment fund, began volunteering with a literacy nonprofit, and even started dating someone seriously for the first time in years. Competence breeds confidence, Dr. Hayes explained. When you prove to yourself that you can change behavior in one area, your brain starts believing that change is possible in other areas too. 6 months into the program, I was managing my life with a level of competence that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. But more importantly, I was enjoying the process. Behavior change had stopped feeling like self-punishment and started feeling like self-care. The system works because it's designed around how human motivation actually functions, Dr. Hayes said during one of our final sessions. Social recognition, immediate rewards, and visible progress aren't crutches. They're the fundamental drivers of all sustainable behavior change. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I was living intentionally rather than just reacting to circumstances. And the best part was that the system felt so natural and rewarding that maintaining it required less effort than my previous cycles of failure and restart had demanded. But the real test would come when Dr. Hayes' study ended and I had to maintain the changes without his guidance. Could someone with my background sustain motivation without external structure, or would I revert to my old patterns of expensive chaos? 1 year after my eviction notice, I'm standing in the renovated penthouse that I now actually own, having purchased it from my former landlord, hosting a dinner party for 12 friends who are all part of what we've come to call our Progress Club, a monthly gathering where we celebrate each other's growth and share strategies for sustainable behavior change. The apartment looks nothing like the chaotic space it once was, not because I've imposed rigid minimalism on it, but because I've learned to design systems that work with my personality rather than against it. Every surface has a designated purpose, every possession has a home, and somehow maintaining this organization has become as automatic as breathing. Tell us about the electricity bill revelation, my friend Marcus says over dinner, referencing a story that's become legendary in our group. I smile, remembering the moment 6 months ago when I received an energy bill that perfectly demonstrated everything Dr. Hayes had taught me about motivation. The utility company had redesigned their billing system using exactly the principles we'd been learning about, I explained to the group. Instead of just showing my usage and the amount due, they showed me how my consumption compared to my neighbors, gave me immediate feedback about my efficiency improvements, and tracked my progress over time. I pull out my phone to show them the bill I'd saved as a perfect example of positive motivation in action. Look at this. They showed that I was using 12% less energy than the average household in my neighborhood, but 8% more than my most efficient neighbors. They gave me a smiley face for being above average, and showed exactly how close I was to earning 2 smiley faces for optimal efficiency. And you actually put it on your refrigerator, Sarah laughs, like you were 8 years old getting a gold star. Because it felt exactly like getting a gold star, I admit. It made efficiency feel like a game rather than a chore. And that's when I realized that Dr. Hayes had been right all along. We never outgrow our need for recognition, progress tracking, and social comparison. We just learn to be ashamed of those needs instead of designing our lives around them. The transformation hasn't been limited to personal organization. Using the same principles Dr. Hayes taught me, I've built systems for every area of my life that matter to me. My investment portfolio, managed through a social investing app that shows how my choices compare to other investors and celebrates good decisions with immediate feedback, has outperformed my previous random approach by 40%. My fitness routine, built around group classes and progress tracking rather than private self-punishment, has made me healthier than I've been since college. Most importantly, I've learned to apply positive motivation principles to helping others. The literacy nonprofit I volunteer with has adopted our Progress Club model, creating peer support groups for adult learners that celebrate small improvements and provide immediate recognition for effort. Reading scores have improved by an average of 30% since we implemented the program. The research was right, I tell the group, referencing the stack of behavioral science papers that now fill my home office. Dr. Sherritt's work proved that warnings and threats don't create lasting change. They create resistance and avoidance. But social incentives, immediate rewards, and progress monitoring work because they align with how our brains are actually designed to learn and grow. My father, who'd been so worried about my trajectory a year ago, now regularly asks for advice about implementing positive motivation systems in his company. "You've figured out something that most successful people never learn," he told me recently. "How to sustain motivation without relying on fear or external pressure." The most profound change has been psychological. I no longer see setbacks as evidence of personal failure, but as information about what conditions support my success. When travel disrupts my routines, I don't abandon my systems, I adapt them. When social events interfere with my plans, I don't feel guilty. I enjoy them, and then return to my preferred patterns without drama. You know what's interesting? Dr. Hayes said during our final formal session, "Your privileged background, which you thought was a liability, actually made you an ideal candidate for positive motivation systems. Because you weren't motivated by fear of consequences, you were free to discover what actually energizes human behavior." He was right. My lack of external pressures had forced me to understand intrinsic motivation in ways that people who rely on desperation or fear never have to explore. And that understanding has become the foundation for a life that's more intentional, more satisfying, and more sustainable than anything I achieved through willpower or self-punishment. Tonight, as I clean up after the dinner party, a process that now takes 15 minutes instead of creating weeks of accumulated mess, I reflect on how completely my relationship with behavior change has transformed. Instead of seeing discipline as self-denial, I now understand it as self-care. Instead of viewing organization as restriction, I recognize it as freedom. Instead of treating motivation as a finite resource that I need to conserve, I've learned to create renewable systems that actually generate energy and enthusiasm. The breakthrough wasn't learning to be someone different. It was learning to work with who I actually am. My brain craves social recognition, immediate feedback, and visible progress, just like every other human brain. The only difference is that I've stopped being ashamed of those needs and started designing my life around them. For anyone reading this who feels like they've tried everything and can't sustain the changes they want to make, I want you to know, the problem isn't your willpower or your character. The problem is that you've been using motivation strategies that go against human psychology instead of working with it. Stop trying to scare yourself into compliance. Stop relying on punishment and consequences. Stop attempting massive transformations that require superhuman discipline. Instead, find people who will celebrate your progress. Create immediate rewards for good choices. Track your improvement over time rather than focusing on perfect adherence. Work with your brain's design for social connection, instant gratification, and visible progress. The science is clear, and my own transformation is proof. Sustainable behavior change isn't about developing more willpower. It's about understanding how motivation actually works and designing systems that make positive choices feel rewarding, social, and progressively easier over time. Change your approach to behavior change, and you change everything else.